The way of being with another person, which is termed empathic, has several facets. It means entering the private perceptual world of the other and becoming thoroughly at home in it. It involves being sensitive moment to moment to the changing felt meanings which flow in this other person, to the fear or rage or tenderness or confusion or whatever that he or she is experiencing. It means temporarily living in his life, moving about in it delicately, without making judgments, sensing meanings of which he is scarcely aware, but not trying to uncover feelings of which he is totally unaware, since this would be too threatening. It includes communicating your sensings of his world as you look with fresh and unfrightened eyes at elements of which he is fearful. It means frequently checking with him as to the accuracy of your sensings and being guided by his responses. You are a confident companion to him in his world. By pointing to the possible meanings in the flow of his or her experiencing, you help him to focus on this useful type of referent, to experience his meanings more fully and to move forward in his or her experiencing. Now, to be with another in this way means that for the time being, you lay aside the views and values that you hold for yourself in order to enter his world without prejudice. Perhaps that description makes clear that being empathic is a complex, demanding, strong, yet subtle and gentle way of being. Many years ago, I realized how powerful it was to listen to a person. And in recent months, I've been working on a paper trying to take a fresh look at the power of listening, at the power of an empathic way of being. And that's what I want to talk to you about. We should re-examine and re-evaluate that very special way of being with another person, which we call empathic. I believe we tend to give too little importance and consideration to an element which is extremely important in the understanding of personality dynamics and for affecting changes in personality and in behavior. I think it's one of the most delicate and potent tools that we have, and I'm impressed at how rarely we see it in real-life situations in any full-fledged form. I guess I'll start with my somewhat faltering history in relation to this topic. Very early in my work as a therapist, I discovered that simply listening to my client very attentively was an important way of being helpful. So when I was in doubt as to what I should do in some active way, I simply listened. And it seemed surprising to me that such a passive kind of interaction could be so useful. And a little later, a social worker whom I hired who had had a background of Ronkian training was really most helpful to me. She helped me to learn that the most effective response, the most effective listening was where you listened for the feelings and emotions that were behind the words, that were just a little bit concealed, and where you could discern a pattern of feeling behind what was being said. And I think she's the one who first suggested that the best response was to reflect these feelings to the client. And reflect is a word that later made me cringe, but at the time it really was very helpful to me in my work as a therapist, and I was very grateful to her. I felt I learned a great deal from her. She learned very little from me. Then came my transition to a full-time university position where, with the help of students, I was finally able to scrounge the equipment for recording our interviews, a dream I'd had for a number of years. And I just can't exaggerate the excitement of our learnings as we clustered about the machine, which enabled us to listen to ourselves, playing over and over again some puzzling point in the interview at which something clearly went wrong, or focusing on those moments in which there seemed to be a response that helped toward significant forward movement in the interview. I guess I still regard listening to one's recorded interviews as perhaps the very best mode of improving oneself as a helping person. And among many lessons from listening to these recordings, we came to realize that listening to feelings and reflecting them was a vastly complex experience. We discovered that we could pinpoint a therapist response where significant forward movement occurred. We could, where perhaps the client was talking in a vague and desultory fashion, and one therapist response would enable him to really begin to move. And you could also pinpoint the responses where a nice forward-moving process was brought to a dead stop by one particular response. So, in such a context of learning, it became quite natural that we focused upon the content of the therapist response rather than upon the empathic quality of the listening. I no longer particularly apologize for that. It probably was a necessary step in our learning. To this extent, we became very much conscious of the techniques that the counselor or therapist was using. We became really expert in analyzing in minute detail. I can remember sitting around with students and picking apart sentences and particular phrases and words. And we profited a great deal from that very microscopic study of the interview process. I think we gained a great deal from it. But this tendency to focus on the therapist's responses had consequences which appalled me. I was meeting considerable hostility as to my point of view, and that really didn't seem to bother me. But this kind of thing did bother me, because the whole approach came in a few years to be known as a technique. Non-directive therapy, it was said, is the technique of reflecting the client's feelings, period. So then you've taken care of non-directive therapy. Or even worse, an even worse caricature was simply that in non-directive therapy, you just say back the last words that the client said. And really, I was so shocked and appalled by that complete distortion of our approach that for a number of years I said almost nothing about empathic listening. And when I did, it was to stress an empathic attitude with very little comment as to how that attitude might be implemented in the relationship. I just became frightened of the distortion. I preferred to discuss the qualities of positive regard and therapist congruence, which I'd come to hypothesize as being two other conditions that were growth promoting in a relationship. And those concepts were often misunderstood too, but they never came to be caricatured in the same way that the empathic listening was caricatured. Over the years, however, the research evidence keeps piling up, and it points strongly to the conclusion that a high degree of empathy in a relationship is possibly the most potent factor, and certainly one of the most potent factors, in bringing about change and learning. And so I believe it's time for me to forget the caricatures and misrepresentations of the past and take a fresh look at empathy. For still another reason, it seems timely to do this. In the United States during the past decade, many new approaches to therapy have held center stage. Gestalt therapy, psychodrama, primal therapy, bioenergetics, rational emotive therapy, transactional analysis are some of the best known, but there are more. And part of their appeal seems to me to lie on the fact that in most instances, the therapist is clearly the expert, actively manipulating the situation, often in dramatic ways, for the client's benefit. But if I read the signs correctly, I believe that there is some decrease in the fascination with such expertise in guiding people. With another approach that is based on expertise, however, behavior therapy, I think there's no doubt that the fascination with that approach is on the increase. And I think I can really understand that. I think a technological society has been delighted to find a technology by which man's behavior can be shaped, even without his knowledge or approval, toward goals that the therapist chooses or that have been chosen by society. And yet, even here, much questioning by thoughtful individuals is springing up as the philosophical and the political implications of such an approach become more clearly visible. So I've seen a willingness on the part of many to take another look at ways of being with people which evoke self-directed change and locate power in the person, not in the therapist. And this brings me again to examine carefully what we mean by empathy and what we've come to know about it. To formulate a current description, I would want to draw on the concept of experiencing as formulated by Gene Gendlin. Briefly, it's his view that at all times there is going on in the human organism a flow of experiencings to which the individual can turn again and again as a referent in order to discover the meaning of what he is experiencing. He sees empathy as pointing sensitively to the felt meaning which the client is experiencing in this particular moment. In order to help him focus on that meaning and to carry it further to its full and uninhibited experiencing. An example may make more clear both the concept and its relation to empathy. A man in an encounter group is making some vaguely negative statements about his father, and the facilitator says, "It sounds as though you might be angry at your father." "No, I don't think so." "Dissatisfied with him?" Perhaps. "Disappointed in him?" Yeah, that's it. I am disappointed in him. I've been disappointed in him ever since I was a child because he is not a strong person. I think that kind of an example, does illuminate Gendlin's concept in this way. Against what is the man checking these various terms? Angry? No, that isn't it. Dissatisfied? Well, that's closer. Disappointed? That matches the flow of, I think, visceral experiencing that's going on within. And a person has a very sure knowledge of that flow and can really tell when you're speaking to it. In other words, the right word taps the right label or the right phrase often taps the exact meaning of the flow that is going on within him that he hasn't been able to label or understand himself. It enables him to bring into awareness the real meaning of what's going on within. So with that conceptual background, I'd like to attempt a description of empathy which would seem satisfactory to me today. I would no longer be terming it a state of empathy, which was in my earlier definition, because I believe it to be a process rather than a state, and perhaps I can capture that quality. The way of being with another person, which is termed empathic, has several facets. It means entering the private perceptual world of the other and becoming thoroughly at home in it. It involves being sensitive moment to moment to the changing felt meanings which flow in this other person, to the fear or rage or tenderness or confusion or whatever that he or she is experiencing. It means temporarily living in his life, moving about in it delicately, without making judgments, sensing meanings of which he is scarcely aware, but not trying to uncover feelings of which he is totally unaware, since this would be too threatening. It includes communicating your sensings of his world as you look with fresh and unfrightened eyes at elements of which he is fearful. It means frequently checking with him as to the accuracy of your sensings and being guided by his responses. You are a confident companion to him in his world. By pointing to the possible meanings in the flow of his or her experiencing, you help him to focus on this useful type of referent, to experience his meanings more fully and to move forward in his or her experiencing. I'll make several brief statements and then endeavor to explain their meaning and significance. When a person is perceptively understood, he finds himself coming in touch with a wider range of his experiencing. This gives him an expanded referent to which he can turn for guidance in understanding himself and in directing his behavior. If the empathy has been accurate and deep, he may also be able to unblock a flow of experiencing and permit it to run its uninhibited course. Well, you may well want to ask me, what do I mean by those statements? I believe they'll be clearer if I present an excerpt from a recorded interview with a woman in the later stages of therapy. This too is an excerpt I've used before, but it's particularly appropriate here. A middle-aged woman is exploring some of the complex feelings that have been troubling her. She says, "I have the feeling it isn't guilt." She begins to weep. "Of course, I can't verbalize it yet. It's just being terribly hurt." And the therapist says, "It isn't guilt except in the sense of being very much wounded somehow." She continues weeping. "It's, often I've been guilty of it myself, but in later years, when I've heard parents say to their children, 'Stop crying,' I've had a feeling, a hurt, as though, well, why should they tell them to stop crying? They feel sorry for themselves. And who can feel more adequately sorry for himself than the child? Well, that's sort of what I mean, as though I thought that they should let him cry and feel sorry for him too, maybe, in a rather objective kind of way. Well, that's something of the kind of thing I've been experiencing. Now, just right now." The therapist says, "That catches a little more of the flavor of the feeling, that it's almost as if you're really weeping for yourself." Yeah. And again, you see there's conflict. Our culture is such that, one doesn't indulge in self-pity. But this isn't, I feel it doesn't quite have that connotation. May have. The therapist says, "You sort of think there's a cultural objection to feeling sorry about yourself, and yet you feel the feeling you're experiencing isn't quite what the culture objects to either." And then, of course, I've come to see and to feel that over this, I've covered it up, and she bursts into tears. But I've covered it up with so much bitterness, which in turn I had to cover up. That's what I want to get rid of. I almost don't care if I hurt. The therapist, "You feel that here at the basis of it, as you experience it, is a feeling of real tears for yourself. But that you can't show, you mustn't show. So that's been covered by bitterness that you don't like, that you'd like to be rid of. You almost feel you'd rather absorb the hurt than to feel the bitterness. And what you seem to be saying quite strongly is, I do hurt, and I've tried to cover it up." The client says, "I didn't know it." The therapist says, like a new discovery, really. The client, I never really did know, but it's almost a physical thing. It's a sort of, as though I were looking within myself at all kinds of nerve endings and bits of things that have been sort of mashed. The therapist says, as though some of the most delicate aspects of you, physically almost, have been crushed or hurt. And she says, yes. And I do get the feeling, oh, you poor thing. Well, here I think it's clear that empathic therapist responses encourage her in the wider exploration of and closer acquaintance with the visceral experiencing that's going on within. She's learning to listen to her guts, to use that inelegant term. She has expanded her knowledge of the flow of experiencing within herself. And here too we see again how this unverbalized visceral flow is used as a referent. How does she know that guilt is not the word to describe her feeling? By turning within, taking another look at this reality, this palpable process which is taking place, this experiencing. I think in the example I was giving that it's pretty clear that when a person is perceptively understood, then he comes, in this case she, comes in touch with a wider range of her experiencing, is able to use that more as an expanded referent, and is able, and this is, I think, a concept that's a little difficult to catch, is able to let a blocked experiencing carry itself through to its real conclusion. And now I'm coming to the conclusions that I want to make in regard to the paper. Really sort of two concluding sections. I want now to back off and give a rather different perspective on the significance of empathy. We can say that when a person finds himself sensitively and accurately understood, he develops a set of growth-promoting or therapeutic attitudes toward himself. Let me explain what I mean. First of all, the non-evaluative and acceptant quality of the empathic climate enables him, as we've seen, to take a prizing, caring, even loving attitude toward himself. And second, being listened to by an understanding person makes it possible for him to listen more accurately to himself, with greater empathy toward his own visceral experiencing, his own vaguely felt meanings. But his greater understanding and prizing of himself opens up to him new facets of his experience, which become a part of a more accurately based self. His self is now more congruent with his experiencing. Thus he has become, in his attitudes toward himself, more caring and acceptant, more empathic and understanding, more real and congruent. But these three elements are the very ones which both experience and research indicate are the attitudes of an effective therapist. So we are perhaps not overstating the total picture if we say that an empathic understanding by another has enabled the person to become a more effective growth enhancer, a more effective therapist for himself. Consequently, whether we are functioning as therapists, as encounter group facilitators, as teachers, or as parents, we have in our hands, if we're able to take an empathic stance, a powerful force for change and growth. I think its strength needs to be appreciated. And then finally, I want to put all that I've said into a larger context, because I've been speaking only of the empathic process. It may seem that I regard it as the only important factor in growthful relationships. I would not wish to leave that impression. I'd like briefly to state my views as to the significance of what I see as the three attitudinal elements making for growth in their relationship to one another. In the ordinary interactions of life, between sex partners, between teacher and student, employer and employee, or between colleagues, it's probable that congruence is the most important element. Such genuineness involves letting the other person know where you are emotionally. It may involve confrontation and the owned and straightforward expression of both positive and negative feelings. Thus, congruence is a basis for living together in a climate of realness. But in certain other special situations, caring or prizing may turn out to be the most significant. Such situations include nonverbal relationships, parent and infant, therapist and mute psychotic, and the like. Caring is also an attitude which is known to foster creativity, a nurturing climate in which delicate and tentative new thoughts and productive processes can emerge. And then, in my experience, there are other situations in which the empathic way of being has the highest priority. When the other person is hurting, confused, troubled, anxious, alienated, terrified, when he's doubtful of his own self-worth, uncertain as to his identity, the gentle and sensitive companionship of an empathic stance, accompanied of course by the other two attitudinal elements, provides illumination and healing. In such situations, it is, I believe, the most precious gift that one can give to another. Hi.
Hi.
I'd like to take a minute or two to forget the crowd and forget the microphones and so on. I'd just like to be quiet for a minute or two and get myself here. Maybe you'd like that too.
I sure would.
Okay. Okay. I don't know what you might like to talk about, but I'm very ready to hear.
Okay. Some of my concerns have been that my fears and my feelings about being competent and fears of dealing in situations, afraid of the unknown. I've been working at the same job, the same type of job for 19 years, which is a technical job. It's why I'm in it, and it's a very easy job. And I feel very secure in it. And last year I finished up my undergraduate work because I was interested in possibly doing counseling, being a counselor. Because to me it's meaningful to communicate on a deeper level. And just for that reason alone, I wanted to get into it because that seemed to be very meaningful. But I feel like I've been procrastinating. I haven't been really pushing for it or asserting myself in doing it. And I think it stems from, am I really able to do it? Will I fail at it? Will I leave the safe, secure situation? That I've really been coasting. And I feel a lot of my life is coasting, just whatever is easy.
I gather you feel a lot of fear about taking the next step or really stopping coasting and really getting involved in what you want to do.
Yeah, that's true.
Can you say any more about that fear? What's the feeling of fear?
The feeling of fear isn't so immediate because I'm not doing it. I'm not taking that step, but it's like I find myself somehow evaluating myself, you know, a lot of the time. You know, will I be able to do it? No. You know, what if I fail? If I do get involved in counseling and I'm nervous and afraid, I won't be a good counselor. I don't have enough knowledge about it. It seems to me that I've been thinking about this lately, and it seems to me that everything seems to be filtered through this. My accomplishments are filtered through this idea that I'm still not competent in what I'm doing.
I just feel I'm not up to it. I don't know enough. I might be nervous. I might fail. I'm really not up to it.
Yeah, it's like even when I do succeed, I tell myself that I was successful. For example, I did very well in undergraduate school, but I say to myself, that's because you kept going over your notes by rote time and time again, that you knew it so well, you know, and that's why, not because you really knew it. I always sort of filter it through this kind of, you know.
So you discount even your knowledge, feeling, I didn't really take it in. I haven't really assimilated it. I just memorized it.
Yeah, and if I didn't memorize it, if I didn't keep going over it and over it, I wouldn't have done so well. So it really doesn't count.
Feel ready? You feel ready?
Yes.
I don't know what caused you to volunteer, why you're here, but I'd be glad to hear whatever's on your mind.
I was invited to volunteer, and I happily accepted. I want to do this, and it was an opportunity presented to me, so I'm here.
Okay.
And I'm feeling quite frightened. And I have not picked out for myself any agenda right now. I can talk a little bit about what's going on in my life, which is my ongoing agenda, I suppose.
But the immediate agenda is that it's kind of scary.
Yes. And I feel really very exposed and self-conscious. But I also feel that some part of me is delighted to be sitting here in front of you and talking to you. I'm a little distracted by some noises behind me of a rumbling. I don't know what that is.
I think that's outside. Anyway, let's try and disregard that.
Okay. I feel not quite as anxious now as I did a moment ago. The most obvious thing for me to talk about is the fact that I'm going through a divorce. Papers were filed in spring, and the divorce should be final in the fall. There's lots of material there, which is very close to the surface for me. I am in a small group which I value very highly. It's been very good for me, and 2 days ago I did a lot of intense work in that small group, ventilated a lot of pain, and talked about what's going on with me, and got some excellent support from my group. Right now I'm feeling a little strange about repeating what I just said at that time.
I don't quite know whether that's the place to start or not, but at least that was helpful to you, I'm gathering.
Yes.
Really got some things out.
Yes. I'm feeling sad that the workshop is going to end in about 24 hours. I feel, with respect to many people here, both a strong connection and some pain that I haven't spent more time with various individuals, ambivalence. And now I'm feeling awkward because I feel as though it's my task to produce something to talk about, and I'm not quite sure what to do with that, and I'm afraid of making a decision which will feel artificial, and so I'm feeling, well, part of me wants to be passive and wait for something to be suggested to me.
It is kind of a tough spot because you don't want to produce a problem. If there is anything you want to talk about, you want it to be real.
That's right. I was immediately, as you said that, I thought of some things that I was feeling as I heard you talking in the first hour and a half. And I was moved by several of the things that you said and the reports you gave. And it comes from a place in me which just very passionately and deeply wants connection, harmony, peace.
I have a dream of trying to get together a group of individuals of international influence, including, I would hope, diplomats, members of multinational corporations, people of that sort, and having them experience the reconciliation of differences within that group, so that then they might, I and my colleagues might create a facilitative climate there which would help them to move toward better understanding of each other, better communication, and where, with that experience behind them, they might be able to apply it in the other situations in which they're currently living and dealing.
Carl R. Rogers has been identified for nearly half a century as one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century. His own books and lectures and the research they have generated have led to significant innovations in counseling technique, personality theory, encounter groups, student-centered teaching, and increased understandings of personal power and what are the fundamental ingredients in successful relationships between men and women. One commentator referred to Dr. Rogers as a man whose cumulative effect on society has made him one of the social revolutionaries of our time. In the discussion we had today, he turned his attention to the problem of achieving an enduring peace in the world.
I think I'd like to tell you about an experience I had last year in doing a demonstration counseling interview in front of a group in West Germany. The woman was simply paralyzed with fear. She told how her home was within dangerous distance of 5 nuclear plants, so that was a source of concern. There were missile sites nearby. The United States was about to deploy further missiles in that same area. There were fighter bombers going overhead every day with loads of bombs. She felt that any day she could be vaporized, and she felt absolutely helpless in that situation. And I felt that her situation seemed so much product of circumstances, I wasn't sure I could be of help to her. But I stayed with her as a companion to her in her fear and her desperation. Wasn't sure how helpful it had been, but a few weeks ago I got a letter saying that that interview had been so meaningful to her. She had tried to talk to other people, and they always found her situation so awful they couldn't help but butt in with advice or reassurance or tell her of their own feelings of desperation, and she never got her feelings all out. She felt very appreciative that I had really stayed with her, clear to the depth of her feelings, and somehow that had helped her to accept her fear and her situation, and made it possible for her to get over her paralysis. She now is much more active in the peace movement and is doing other things of a political nature, so that she felt much better about herself in relation to this really dreadful situation. But I think it epitomizes the attitudes of a lot of people in Europe who are much closer to the situation than we are in this country, although we're in almost equal danger. In her letter to me just a short time ago, she closed with this remark, which was very touching and somehow quite dreadful. She said, the new U.S. missiles are almost in my backyard, but somehow, paradoxically, that's helped me. She said, I feel sure that if war should start, and she and many others are sure that the U.S. is determined to have war, if war should start, I'll be dead in the first minutes. And somehow that has helped me to feel more calm about it all. So it's that kind of a situation that we face as a world, and it is absolutely new in the history of the world. There never has been a time like this.
You've written there's a real paradox about that, in the sense that the very time that advances in understanding people and technology are allowing us to lead better and more fulfilling lives, we've also moved to the point where a miscalculation can destroy much of life as we know it.
And where it seems as though our government is increasingly set on a course of, I don't know whether you could even call it diplomacy, but of international relations, which rely entirely on force or intimidation and the threat of force. We seem almost to have forgotten that there are other avenues to peace, that what we need is understanding and communication, not threats and new weapons.
You've commented that there's almost a very simple paradigm that will explain many kinds of confrontations. What is that paradigm?
Yes, it's interesting to think about any dispute that you know, actually between individuals or between groups or between nations. It gets to the dangerous point when I feel I'm right and you're wrong. I'm good and you're bad. And the dangerous part is that you on your side feel exactly the same, that you are right and I'm wrong, you are good and I'm bad.
And that your motives can't be trusted, but
That's
mine
right.
can.
That's right. And that's certainly not hypothetical. Here we have our government saying that the Soviet Union is the empire of evil, the focus of evil in this world, and the Soviets feeling that we're warmongers and intent on having war. It's all of those things help to distance the other. In other words, you're not really a person, you're just evil. And so that would justify wiping you out or going to war. And it isn't until the contending parties are in sufficient relationship that they can begin to understand the pattern that I've just described, that there's any hope of coming to a reconciliation.
In a way, people seem in their own lives to be trying to move away from stereotypes, but governments are not able to do that. Why is that? What is it about the government? Is it governments as they operate that...
I think that institutions always lag behind the popular advance. I think that as a society, as individuals in society, we're moving away from the stereotype of the macho individual who has to fight at the drop of a hat, the John Wayne, the George Patton. We're moving away from that. Jesse Jackson said recently, you're not a man because you can kill somebody, but because you can heal somebody. And that's beginning to be more and more the common feeling, that to be an understanding person, to accept the fact that in every individual there is the yin and the yang, the masculine and feminine principle, and that the macho ideal is really passé. But within our institutions, and particularly in our government, we're still clinging to the macho symbol, a macho way of doing. We tempt out the Libyan planes and then shoot down 2 of them. We continue to fire at the Syrians in Lebanon when it's no longer in defense of our Marines. We just unnecessarily threaten or use force in ways that seem to be a prelude to destruction unless we're able to stop that pattern in our international relationships.
Okay, for over nearly half a century, you've been very consistent in indicating that people have an inner wisdom, the ability to guide their conduct wisely, that they can trust their basic instincts. You've also applied that thinking to a number of institutions to encourage them to return power to the person, a sense of control, back to those people who will guide things well. How do you square that with the circumstances that you've just described of moving closer and closer to the brink?
Well, for one thing, we really have developed ways of being and attitudes and skills which show great promise in dealing with feuding parties, with hostile groups and so on. But that has not been bought by our culture as a whole. They're really not aware of that. They haven't put it to use. It's interesting that if I should develop a new technical aspect for computers, that would be used immediately and probably spread over the country like wildfire. We develop new social skills, and society really is not aware that those are available. It's, in my estimation, somewhat like the situation when the Wright brothers first showed that powered planes could take off. That attracted a little attention, but it didn't make any dent on society until suddenly, when Lindbergh flew the Atlantic, then society realized, oh, this could have application. This might apply to me. This might have meaning for my life. And immediately it all sprang into the great aviation industry that we have now. And I feel we're waiting for that moment of realization in regard to the social procedures that we have that might hold promise for dealing with international relationships.
Okay, so your basic positive view of human nature you feel is valid. That it's the fact that as an organized society, as a culture, that we've gone part of the way toward where we need to be, and that part is that we really are open as a society to new technologies, that we can interrelate those technologies with unusual finesse and promptness. But it's in that part of our culture, its social organization, that we're breaking down.
That's true, or lagging behind. And yes, we are both breaking down and lagging behind in our appreciation of what's possible. For example, in my own experience, I've dealt with feuding groups from Belfast. I've dealt with black-white groups. The most fascinating one recently was holding a black-white encounter group on stage in South Africa in front of an audience of 600 people, where it started out with a lot of bitterness, and even in a relatively short time you could begin to see the development of more understanding. We weren't able to continue that beyond an initial phase.
This is part of indicating that we do know as a society some ways to proceed to reduce tensions that we haven't. Before analyzing each of those in detail, the crux seems to be, in your view, translating the inner wisdom of people, what's known about how to deal with conflicts and problems between people, to getting that applied to the society as at large, to the larger culture. I wonder if we could take several of the major institutions of society and ask you to indicate how you see them either facilitating or currently blocking the the adoption of a better social system for working out differences. Let's start with religion. What role do you see religion currently playing?
Well, I think that religion is a polarity. I think some aspects of religion, like I would call it so-called religion, the moral majority and the fundamentalist groups and so on, probably their impact is more to divide people than to bring people together. On the other hand, at the other pole are people of perhaps broader views, and I think they have had a more positive influence in helping to create understanding of other groups and to help somewhat toward peace. Religion has a bad name historically in this regard because it has more often been responsible for war than for peace, I feel. But there certainly are many people in the religious field today who are working intelligently for peace.
How about business as an institution in our society? It's a major focus for the transmission of technology and an effective way to improve people's lives.
That's a field in which I'm really not close, but I am interested in the recent publications which point out that war is bad for business, and that business can exercise real influence over governments and over diplomats in insisting on more communication and in avoiding the catastrophe that seems to hang over us.
What is the role you view of government today?
Let me answer that personally. I have a dream of trying to get together a group of individuals of international influence, including, I would hope, diplomats, members of multinational corporations, people of that sort, and having them experience the reconciliation of differences within that group, so that then they might, I and my colleagues might create a facilitative climate there which would help them to move toward better understanding of each other, better communication, and where, with that experience behind them, they might be able to apply it in the other situations in which they're currently living and dealing.
So government is not right now doing some things that you think it could adopt that would dramatically improve the situation?
Very definitely. I feel that at the present time, it's hard to say government because there are lots of governments in the world. I'll restrict it to our own government. I feel that our own government is often doing things that divide rather than bring together, that create misunderstanding rather than understanding. It's so easy to make an object out of the other, and then anything goes. And it seems to me that characterizes the attitude of our government today.
What about the role of education? You've written throughout your career about the significance of education, particularly if it approaches its task differently. Your book, Freedom to Learn, has been very influential in America in terms of how schools organized and in thinking about the nature of the learning process. What role does education have today?
Again, I feel it. I'll say what I think of its actual role and what the role it might have. I feel that our educational institutions are disappointing in that, disappointing to me, in that they are probably the most authoritarian structures in our culture. They talk about democracy. They're the schools of a supposed democracy, and yet it is a strictly pyramidal structure with power at the top and distributed down through the levels, with the students having little or no power of choice or decision, so that they are trained They are educated, actually, to be a part of a conformist society, controlled by others. And yet, our ideals and what we say we want is for them to be independent individuals capable of making choices. And there is ample evidence in practice and in research, I brought it out in the revision of my book, Freedom to Learn for the 80s, how much experience there is now and how much research showing that when students are given more freedom to learn and a facilitative learning climate is created, they accomplish more, they learn more of the basic subjects, they're more creative, they're more spontaneous. They're the kind of individuals who would be capable of understanding another rather than shutting him out. And I feel that even in some of the elementary schools, interesting experiments are going on in teaching very young youngsters, very young children, how to resolve conflicts between them peacefully without fighting. And I think that could go a long ways in raising a generation of individuals who will have had the experience of dealing with conflicts constructively.
But there are two institutions of our organized culture that allow some hope for intervening on a larger scale. I'm talking here obviously about education and the family. How would you want the families of the current generation to act, to prepare people to be more receptive to the types of social insights that you've talked about?
I've been very interested in watching families in which the parents have learned, partly due to their experience in intensive groups or in therapy, something like that, have learned how to create a growthful climate for their children. And the children develop in ways that are astonishing and exciting. They're better able to communicate. They're more respectful of others. They're more social in a deep sense, not more polite necessarily, but more social, and more interested in others and interested in people. And I think that they're also learning from their parents and from a fragment of society how to deal with conflict in relationships. In that sense, they're preparing themselves to be a part of this social advance that we so desperately need.
In order that the next generation be more attuned to the importance of the kinds of social changes and awareness of the importance of conflict resolution, would you recommend some changes in our educational structure as we prepare the leaders of the 21st century?
Yes, I suppose that what I would recommend are fairly revolutionary changes. When I was working recently on the revision that I've done of my book, Freedom to Learn, I was astonished to find how many places there are in this country, how many teachers, how many schools are really turning education upside down in their own situation. They're giving students a chance to choose what they're most interested in learning. They're helping students to evaluate themselves rather than always being evaluated by others. They're creating the kind of climate in the classroom where differences can be worked out rather than settled by an authoritarian teacher. So that it's very definitely evident and demonstrated that our educational institutions can become places where citizens are prepared to, in their own experience, to accept and adopt these social technologies which would help to reduce conflict in the world.
But your position is there's a whole technology that education could use to help people learn to resolve issues more peacefully in their lives. It's not being employed.
That's true if by technology you understand that it is a technology based on a philosophy and a whole approach. It's not simply gimmicks or tricks, but it is a philosophical way of being which has been amply demonstrated and where we know how it can be done. In my experience, I've found the human organism to be, at its core, a constructive organism. I know that in some ways that runs counter to millions of Christians who believe that man was conceived in sin and born evil and can only be redeemed by the grace of God. I know that it also runs counter to the view held by most Freudians that if the inner core of man is reached, that's a wild, destructive core that must be tamed and controlled. My experience does not bear out either of those views. One way of putting it is that when I'm dealing with an individual who's having difficulty, or who's a criminal, or who's engaged in antisocial behavior, I can count on the fact that if I can get through the surface defenses, there is a positive core which wants to be more social, more constructive in its behavior. On the other hand, I can't count on the fact that there will be an equally strong destructive influence. That seems to me to be the product of circumstances, of environment. We do many things to shape the individual to become destructive and to engage in behavior we call evil, but I don't believe that's inherent or genetically present in the human being.
You've written that it's really the social tensions that endanger us at this point. What do you mean?
Well, I mean that, for example, a missile in itself is dangerous, but that's not our real source of danger. The real source of danger is the attitude we have toward potential enemies. It's the hatreds and the feuds and the animosities that stir people to violence and to war. And so that's my meaning there.
Okay, and you've further written that the primary method of dealing with tensions at the national and international level is through either intimidation or the actual use of force. Why is it? Is that rooted in human nature, or is that some cultural aberration?
I think it's partly because of our cultural history and partly because of our technology. Our cultural history has stressed the fact that it is the role of the leader to be a fighter, an aggressive person, and that still is an important part of our culture, that belief. Then another thing that is not always recognized enough is that disputes which would be minor become major when both individuals or both parties have machine guns and rocket launchers and anti-aircraft guns and so on, so that disputes which might be just minor struggles between two parties become small, vicious wars, and our technology has a great deal to answer for in being responsible for that. We've created the weapons of war without developing the educated people who would know how to use such weapons with restraint or not use them at all.
Dr. Rogers, thank you for sharing with us today your insights into the way
Carl Rogers, the founder of client-centered therapy, has been a major contributor to the field of counseling for over 4 decades. A former president of the American Psychological Association and the recipient of its award for outstanding professional contributions, he's authored such important books in the counseling field as Client-Centered Therapy and On Becoming a Person. Since turning 65, he's written over 40 articles, and his most recent books include On Encounter Groups, Freedom to Learn, Becoming Partners, and On Personal Power. In this film, he turns his attention again to the field of counseling. With him for the interview is John M. Whiteley, a member of the Social Ecology faculty and Dean of Students at the University of California, Irvine.
Carl, what assumptions are you making about the nature of man from which you build your theory?
Well, I think really there's one assumption which has become more of a conviction based on experience for me, and that is that the human organism is a trustworthy entity. Or to put it in other words, that persons can be trusted if you provide the right kind of psychological climate for them to open up and express themselves and develop, so that it's assuming that the human organism is just like all other organisms in the universe, that it can be trusted to move in a constructive direction, providing there aren't too many distorting and warping circumstances surrounding it.
Well, within a person, then, is the capacity for growth if you can create an environment in which it can grow. Now, writing 3 decades ago, you said that certain conditions were necessary and sufficient for providing for that change. From the perspective of being into encounter groups, thinking about men and women, writing on education, and lately personal power, have you changed your view?
I think that my belief in those conditions of empathy and congruence and caring, if you want to call it, has deepened, but it has also gone on beyond that. For one thing, an increasing amount of research supports the fact, tends to confirm the fact that those conditions do tend to facilitate constructive change and growth. But I think I've also come to feel that place more emphasis on the person of the therapist being present. That you really have to be present to this other person in all aspects of your being. And I don't know if that's easy to define in intellectual terms. I know what it feels like when I feel really present to a person, and I think they recognize that too.
What does it feel like to you? You said you can have that feeling within yourself.
I feel as though I'm all there and all with this person. I'm not holding myself back.
Mm-hmm.
I'm well, one word I sometimes use is I feel as though I'm kind of transparent at that moment, that the person can really see through me. Not putting up any barrier. I'm not hiding behind anything.
You're really being yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And in that sense, one of your conditions being very genuine.
Mm-hmm.
What about anger, then? Is anger something you've written and thought about?
Yes, it is. It's something that has always been somewhat of a problem with me. I don't express anger easily. Mm-hmm. But there I think that my experience in encounter groups has helped me to be more free in expressing anger. For whatever reason, I really don't I don't think I've ever really felt angry in dealing with an individual client, but I have felt angry in groups, and have learned to try to express that anger when it occurs. What I usually do is what I used to do and don't do quite so often, would be to actually be angry and not realize it until afterward. Mm-hmm. And I like it so much better when I can be aware of it, when I'm feeling it, and express it toward the person or the situation that really aroused the anger. So I'm learning, but I still have plenty to learn.
Is there a conflict between the genuineness you were speaking of and the transparency on the one hand and the caring on the other if you're really angry at somebody?
That's why I put congruence or genuineness first. In other words, I think it's very valuable if you can feel a caring for this person. But if what you are at that moment is angry at him, it's far better to be angry than to pretend a caring you don't really feel.
And let them know that that sharing of it is also important.
That's
the growth
right.
of the
That's right.
relationship.
In any close relationship, people always feel, I think, how risky it is to share negative feelings with someone that you feel caring toward. And yet that is a constructive thing to do.
What is it that you do that helps another person change their behavior?
I think what I do is simply to provide the climate we've talked about, but what brings about change in behavior in this other person is the gradual change in concept of self. That when the person comes to see himself or herself in a new way, say moves from feeling unworthy and lacking in confidence and all that, to a feeling of greater confidence, greater sense of worth, greater liking of self, then behavior begins to change as a result of that. Some of our research quite long ago supported that in a modest kind of way, but I certainly have come to believe it clinically very strongly, that changes in behavior follow changes in the way a person sees himself or herself and the way that he feels about self.
The client has some real choice about how to direct their own growth, I take it, which is a very different model than the behaviorists or the Freudians.
That's true. I think that when there comes about this change in feelings about self, then you get a realization, I have a choice. I can behave in the old way or I can behave in a new way.
And this relates back to the first assumption we began with, that people have the capacity within themselves to make changes wisely and growthfully for them.
Yes, I think that my experience has been that if I'm able to do a satisfactory job of providing these conditions that we've talked about, then I can really trust the fact that the person will move in directions that are not only personally constructive, but socially constructive. And if that I know that seems strange to some people, why would they move in directions that are socially constructive? I believe it's because of the species we belong to. Man is essentially a social animal and prefers to live in harmony with others, in spite of all the wars and rumors of wars going on. Given the opportunity for free choice, he prefers a harmonious relationship with others rather than a disharmonious relationship.
What do you do in terms of method when you're working with a client? Do you use confrontation as a technique?
I would say that the times when I'm most unhappy with myself as a counselor are those times when I catch myself using a technique. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm not open to knowing about techniques. I'm open to using them if they feel so spontaneous at the moment that it's not a technique. It's when, I don't know whether you call this a technique or not, it's something that's very real to me. I've learned to trust my intuition. Sometimes in the midst of an interview, something will crop up, especially if I'm quite close to this client, feel in tune with this client, something will crop up in me that wants to be said, and it may have no relationship to what's going on. It may seem, from my intellectual point of view, totally foolish to say that. But I've learned to trust it and to say that. And I would say 8 times out of 10, it proves to be something very meaningful to the client.
You really allow yourself that same trust in yourself that you're attributing to the client.
It's been increasing.
What about reflecting? I think there's probably been no aspect of your work that's been more singled out for analysis and perhaps misunderstanding than reflecting. What do you mean, and what do you want people to understand about what you mean?
Yes, there are statements like client-centered therapy is simply the reflection of feelings. Well, I don't know, we may have been responsible for starting that term. If so, I regret that. Because the real aim is to understand the feeling. In other words, I want to be a companion to the client and to be right with him or her in exactly what's going on inside at the moment. The only way I can find that out, whether I am being that sort of a companion, is to check it. Is this what you've been trying to say? Is this what you're feeling? It sounds as though you're experiencing such and such. And if the answer is no, then I would drop that immediately. It's so that what is termed reflection of feelings is an attempt to check my understanding of what's going on inside the client with his understanding of it, and to therefore correct myself so that I can go in the same path that he's following.
So you do it both to correct yourself and to let the client know that I understand what you're saying.
That's right. And it can be a very rewarding and opening thing for a client to realize, my God, you understood that? Nobody ever understood me before. I think that we have no realization of the fact that real empathic understanding is one of the rarest things in the experience of any of us. And to find that I bring out something, that I as a client bring out something very tentative, something I'm afraid of, something I've never told anyone else, and this other person seems to really understand it, not in a general way, but in its nuances and in its delicate shadings. Wow, that's a tremendous experience. I'm no longer so alone. And then it also means that I'm encouraged to say more. I'm encouraged to go further into myself. If I can be understood at this level, then perhaps I could be understood at still another level. And there's one other function that it serves too, that probably should be mentioned. And that is that if someone expresses a confused and difficult feeling, do you have that, to find the other person understands it in somewhat different terms is often very clarifying. In other words, oh yeah, that's what I've been meaning. That's what I've been trying to say. And you see a look of real relief at the greater clarification that the client feels.
What about insight? Insight is another dimension that's been talked about a lot. What is insight in your own model?
Well, I think in the earlier formulations I used the term insight quite a lot. I doubt if I have used that for quite a number of years, because I think the much more accurate term, there is such a thing as insight, but the more accurate change agent is experiencing. I think, for instance, I recall an interview I had just recently where a client wanted to express some of the deep hurt that he felt. But he went all around that, describing it, talking about it, and only for one moment did he let himself really experience that hurt. Now it's when he can let himself experience the hurt fully that then there's the chance of sensing it at a gut level and really being able to change. That's insight of a gut level sort. Well, I think everyone realizes this is often talked about, that people can have all kinds of intellectual insight and it doesn't change their behavior a particle. They can know all about the causes of their behavior in their childhood and all the traumas they've had and so forth, and their behavior may remain exactly the same. On the other hand, if they've experienced some deep feeling aspect that has been buried in the past, then you're going to find that's an opening to change.
Because having an understanding of those feelings in an emotional sense frees one to continue to grow.
Right. It's as though if a feeling has been deeply buried, and now I'm able to let myself experience it fully, then I can move on beyond that. Up to that point, it's been something blocking my development, blocking my forward movement. But if I can let myself realize, oh, I am hurting, and really let that soak in, then I can begin to let that hurt go by and move on to other phases of existence.
You've already pointed out how you're using experiencing as instead of insight, and that reflecting, while you may have introduced it with one set of meanings originally, you have a very different set of conceptions about what you mean and what that conveyed. Are there some other changes over the last several decades as you've broadened into encounter groups and applied your thinking to men and women and to personal power that you would single out as important?
One thing that comes to mind is that I have become much more aware of the power aspect of all of these relationships, whether we're talking about teacher-student or therapist-client or whatever. And I realize that the stance I take on that is actually a very radical stance that I try in every way possible, whether I'm talking about students or clients or close relationships like marriage relationships. My desire is to keep the power with that person, to empower the person, not to have power over, but to help him sense his or her own power and begin to utilize it and realize I do have the strength and capacity to do things for myself. And that to me is, it's very different from most approaches, because most therapists, most teachers have varying degrees of authority over the other person. They feel I am the expert, and therefore I know what you should learn, or I know what's wrong with you, and so it is a power relationship.
Well, it seems to me in education you've remarked that one person can't teach another person anything worth learning. And it seems that you hold that same model for individual growth as well.
In fact, the realization of that came first in counseling, because I started out in times when, of course, the counselor's function was to tell the client what to do. And I was, it's interesting to look back on that and see I gradually drew back and drew back and drew back from that because it was so damned ineffective.
So you moved away from it because it didn't work.
That's right.
Not because you'd somehow challenged initially the knowledge is power, or there's a professional mystique in counseling as a role.
All those things came later, but because I was just as much expert-oriented as the next person when I started in. But I think I have always been quite pragmatic and have tried to follow up clients and follow up learning process in students and so on, and came to realize that if I want to look very smart, then play the part of the expert. That looks good. If I want to really foster a process of learning, then empower the person and create a climate a facilitated climate where that person can learn the things that he or she needs to learn.
Okay, so challenging really the power basis of our society's organization is one major change that's occurred over the last several decades. Would you single out any more?
Certainly, I certainly can detect another change in practice, and that is that initially, partly because I was so enamored of this fact that the client did have capacity to move forward, and partly I think because of my own insecurities in interpersonal relationships, I was more aloof from the client. I did try to facilitate things, but keeping myself quite out of it. Now I would feel that I want to be there with my feelings too, but I don't want to. But my feelings I like to own as my feelings, not as something you should be feeling. And so it's a more personal, warmer, closer, more intimate relationship, really. And then another change I've noticed in myself is that I am no longer so afraid of intimacy. I wouldn't have thought of touching a client during an interview when I first started in. Now that comes very naturally.
I think that's in part a result of the encounter group
Yes,
movement.
it is. I feel as though the encounter group movement and being in groups myself has helped me to change and grow.
How, which gets to the next question I was going to ask you, how has your life been shaped and your own personal understandings clarified as a result of your role as a counselor and a person who's thought about counseling very carefully?
Oh, it's only changed every aspect of my life, that's all. I would say that, as I recall, at first I began to realize if I deal with a client this way, why do I deal with a committee or with a staff so much differently? So then I began to change some administrative functions. Then if I deal with a client that way, how come I don't deal with my children that way? How come I don't deal with my wife that way? I can't think of any aspect of my life that hasn't been changed by my experience as a counselor. What I would say to sort of sum that up is that I think one reason people are drawn to this person-centered way of working is that it is a person-centered way of being. It isn't just something you put on for certain hours. It really is a lot of convictions about the way life is, and trying to live that way.
How do you translate this to the goals that you'd like to see clients achieve as a result of working with you? This is very clearly a value question, and saying that counseling isn't value-free in its most basic sense. What are your values for clients?
My one prime value is the person, and so if this client comes out of the process more confident as a person, more free as a person, more open to all aspects of their experience, and therefore more able to choose intelligently among the behavior options and so on, more of a person in intimate relationships, therefore more free to love, or to withdraw from a relationship if it's a hurtful relationship. But I would like that person to be as open to themselves and as open to the environment as possible. Then they will do creative things. I think they will find their life more fulfilling. And so it's a goal which has no specifics. In other words, it isn't saying, so then they will behave in just this way or that way. It's the kind of inner sense of I am a free, responsible, potent person. That would be what I would hope clients would come to feel.
Carl R. Rogers, as the originator of client-centered therapy and a vigorous champion of a humane, person-oriented tradition in American psychology, has been without doubt the most influential leader in the counseling profession. Through his many writings, which include On Becoming a Person, Client-Centered Therapy, and on Counseling and Psychotherapy, and through national leadership, which has included the presidency of the American Psychological Association, Dr. Rogers has served as a model of scientific integrity, personal openness, genuineness, and warmth to two generations of professionals. From his early interest in individual therapy, his interests have broadened to include a deep and abiding concern with the process of education, best expressed in his book, Freedom to Learn. The potential of the encounter group movement, reflected in his book, Carl Rogers on encounter groups, and marriage and the relationships between men and women, the subject of his book, On Becoming Partners. Dr. Rogers has addressed himself to the question of whether there are any factors in the partnership between men and women which distinguish between those which are satisfying, enriching, growthful, and permanent from those relationships which are unenhancing, ending in unhappiness, separation, or divorce. In this film, he describes the threads which he has discerned in successful and fulfilling partnerships. With Dr. Rogers is Dr. John M. Whiteley, a member of the Social Ecology faculty and Dean of Students of the University of California, Irvine.
Carl, what have you learned from your investigations about the themes of enrichment between men and women?
Well, I think through interviewing quite a number of couples, I have come to some thoughts about some of the elements of what constitute a healthy marriage and perhaps a continuing one. Let me say first, I think that lots of people think of marriage sort of as a cage. They lock themselves into the vow, and then they may try to, decorate the inside of the cage with a nice furniture and a swimming pool and everything else, but it's still a cage. And I think one of the things I've learned is that if it's going to be a healthy marriage, it is a flowing kind of process in which the two people are dedicated to working together on the changing process of the present relationship. Not because it's a duty, but because they're finding it rewarding in the present moment, and they want to nourish it and have it continue to grow. I think that one of the partners can begin to work on that process, but unless it becomes a mutual working together on a relationship which is changing all the time, and in which they're working on the present. I don't think it does much good to try to straighten out the past. You can't change the past. And it doesn't do too much good to speculate about the future. But they can work on the changing present in order to try to enlarge it, enrich it, make it more meaningful for both of them.
In describing this commitment to the process of a relationship, you seem to be leaving out the noble sentiments of I love you or I exist to make you happy. Why is that? What did you learn about?
Because I think just the plain statistics show that, and this may sound cynical or something, but it's just the truth, that no matter how sacred the vows are or how much the person means them at the time, they do not hold. If the marriage becomes really unsatisfactory, it's going to either break up, as in Los Angeles County, 4 out of 5 of them do, or else.
Let's stay there again. Not 4 out of 5 marriages break up.
4 out of 5. In 1971, there were 4 applications for dissolution of marriage to every 5 applications of marriage in Los Angeles County. That's an urban county, but I have a feeling that that's not typical of the country, but I feel it may be typical of what the country is coming to. And so we have to recognize we're dealing with a failing institution as it is. And part of what I'm saying is that I think it is failing because for many reasons, but one reason is that too many people do regard it as a box into which they've shut themselves, and now they're going to stay there for the rest of their lives.
So the static quality of I exist to make you happy, or I'm going to dedicate myself to making our marriage work, isn't, from your investigation, a really useful thread or a
hopeful commitment even.
No, I really don't think it is. As I say, that may sound almost cynical or shocking, but people cannot keep vows which no longer have any meaning in the present. They might have had at the time, but they can't keep them in the present. And that's why I think if we could only change the concept of marriage from being this cage idea to a flowing river in which perhaps the two partners are trying to swim together or canoe together or whatever analogy you want to use, that's when they get committed to the fact that nobody knows what's around the next bend. They've got to be working on the changing quality of the relationship as it is at this moment if it's going to be a healthy marriage.
Well, if a commitment to the present, to the process of working through the relationship is one thread, what else have you learned?
Well, I think there are other elements, and one of them certainly has to do with the communication. I think that this applies in many relationships beside marriage, but applying it to marriage, all of us feel at times bored with the other person or angry or really very happy about the situation or various feelings. We don't always communicate those, and I don't think it's necessary. But if I'm continuously bored with my partner or feel continuously resentful or angry, I had better voice that. I think one does much better to take the risk of communicating feelings of that sort in a marriage relationship rather than to think they can be shut out of the picture.
That seems to run counter, though, to the conventional wisdom, which is if there's a problem, we'll sort of put it aside, and we really won't have to deal with persisting feelings.
And I've interviewed so many couples, sometimes they can put it aside for a year, sometimes for 5 years, probably some of them even longer. But it doesn't stay put in this day and age. I was talking the other day to a young wife who no longer loves her husband, and he phoned her from a distant town to tell her he was sleeping with the neighbor's wife, which shows something of his attitude toward the marriage. I couldn't quite tell why he phoned her, but they had never communicated this, and her whole feeling was that, well, she was bound up to a life of martyrdom, that she had vowed she would live with this man. She was stuck with it no matter what. And she may stick with it for a while, but that isn't going to last. That just isn't going to last. So that any persisting feeling, I think, is better off for being communicated. I think the marriage is more healthy. And this applies to positive feelings, too. Men in our culture don't easily say how tenderly they feel toward somebody else, or for some men and some women, it's terribly hard to really say and mean it, I love you, largely because they're thinking of this as a permanent vow. But if they could recognize, right now, I just love you a lot, that could have tremendous meaning for them.
I would wonder if people don't feel it's a pretty risky path you're encouraging them to go on for a wife to say to her husband, I simply don't find our sexual relations rewarding. Or vice versa. For the man to say that to the woman is risking an awful lot about the process of who they are, and certainly relating it to the first thread, you're putting a pretty risky set of feelings on working on the process. Why is that a good thing to do?
I think there's no use kidding ourselves. Any partnership between a man and a woman is a risky business. Those figures I cited show that the risk is not imaginary. It's a very real risk. So the question is not whether you're going to take a risk. The question is, which is the greater risk? And my feeling is that you are really taking much less of a risk to say, to use your example, if the wife says to the husband, I just don't feel the sexual relationship is good from my angle. Yeah, that's risky. But the outcome of that is much more likely to be something coming back from him. That he'll say, well, I never realized that, or I thought you were satisfied, or well, it's great for me, or at any rate, they're off on a pathway of communication in which they begin to reveal themselves to each other. And that gets them into the present, also just naturally gets them into the question of, well, what are we going to do about this? I mean, the moment a problem is faced openly, it's very hard to just let it sit there. And so people begin to think about what steps they could take to remedy the situation.
What else have you learned?
What else? Well, one thing that probably would seem surprising in view of the fact that so often marriage is thought of as sort of a merging of two people, or the wife submerging herself to the husband's position and so on. I don't find that helps. I think that marriages that are healthy and likely to continue, and the ones that have continued, are those in which each partner has developed his or her own separate and unique self, which is a lifetime process of discovery and trying to be more of one's real feelings and so on.
That's a pretty paradoxical notion you're introducing, though, that a man and a woman can't become one as partners until they become two.
I think it is paradoxical, and like a number of paradoxes, I think it's quite true. I think that many people, probably more women than men, have found that that if they feel, I'll really submerge myself in your interests, I'll be your partner. I'll be your partner in a secondary sense. I'll be the supportive one and so on. That may work all right for a time, but again, that's not a very good prognosis for a healthy continuance of their marriage. It's much more exciting for two separate people to be involved in a partnership where they can share each other, each other's interests, and each other's differing thoughts and values than it is to be artificially together.
That does run counter again to the conventional wisdom that somehow a man and a woman have to share every interest together, and the health of their relationship is in the how totally intertwined they are in almost all our interests.
Well, I think there's a lot of both folk wisdom and statistical evidence that I would be inclined to challenge. With a large area of common interest, yes, that's helpful, but not if it's sort of artificially compressed. I mean, if they happen to have common interests, well and good. But if they try to, if one tries to submerge interests in order to merge with the other person, that I don't think is good. Of course, they can develop interests together. That's a very healthy thing.
It seems that our society is really offering, however, a set of instant identities that tend to keep people from developing as separate selves, which may have really long-range, disastrous consequences for the permanence of the partnership or the enrichment of it.
I have certainly come across a number of instances of exactly that, where one partner or the other, it's more often the wife, but not always, hopes to find, I'll put it in feminine terms for the moment. Perhaps the wife hopes to find herself by taking on the identity of her husband. And that may seem like, quite a relief for a time. There's no longer any necessity of looking for herself. But in this modern, changing, individualistic world, I will be highly skeptical that that can last permanently. At some point, she's going to begin to feel, I'm not him. Here I've had all these feelings which are different from the ones he has. I'm not the person he is. I'm really a different person. And what am I going to do with that? But usually, if she has found her identity in her husband and his work and his interests and so on, all these other feelings pile up to the point where they get quite explosive. So that that again is why I put in the notion of expressing any persisting feeling, because otherwise it does pile up until it blows the cork, and that can blow the marriage too.
You mentioned 3 threads. Have you found any others?
Well, there's one other element. I think that in the healthy marriage, people are not trying to, neither partner is trying to live by the expectations that society places on them, or by the shoulds that get oppressively put on them by family, by religion, by others.
You mean for what a man ought to be like and
That's
how he
right.
ought to behave?
How a wife ought to be and how a husband ought to be and so forth, yeah. I think that the more they can drop those roles and expectations, the better off the marriage is likely to be.
And work out something for them that's
right.
fulfilling.
They turn to the things that they find valuable and real, not what, in other words, the wife behaves in ways that are satisfying for that marriage, not the way that a wife is supposed to behave. The husband behaves in ways that are satisfying for that partnership, not what he's supposed to be according to the books or society or religion or anything else.
What are the pressures on the woman that you've seen for a specific kind of role?
I think the woman's role is certainly changing rapidly at the present time, but there's no doubt that in the past to be passive and submergent and supportive and we're pretty well away from obedience, but at any rate, there are a lot of role expectations on the woman.
And what about on the man?
On the man, he's supposed to be the provider. He's supposed to be the responsible one. He's supposed to be much less emotional. He can't cry. His wife could, but the man can't cry. There are a lot of things that, and he's supposed to look after his wife. Can he provide for her properly? All that.
That seems to leave out the child that's in all of us, or the kinds
right.
of feelings that are very human but not rewarded or approved by society as a whole.
And the fact that in every man there is partly a woman, and in every woman there's partly a man. I mean, we kid ourselves into thinking we're either completely masculine or completely feminine. We're not. A man can weep and get emotional and very tender, and a woman can be strong and take initiative and have lots of purpose and drive. And those are real parts of them in addition to the things that we usually think of as masculine and feminine.
So the key thing here is to learn in the crucible of the relationship a satisfying way for each to relate toward the other.
That's right. The things that they sense really have value in their partnership. Never mind what the world says.
Well, you've singled out 4 threads here: commitment to the process of the relationship, becoming separate people before you can really become a partnership, working out a satisfying sex role vis-a-vis the other partner, And lastly, importantly, risking communication on the persisting feelings that are a part of any relationship. These are not the typical things that are taught to us as people, as part of development, either when we're younger or during those critical years when lasting, or at least the start of partnerships are formed between men and women. How should our education be different for enriching partnerships?
I think one of the things that I feel most strongly about after interviewing quite a number of couples is the horrible lack of preparation for partnership in our schools, in our families, in our culture. Even primitive cultures prepare their people for being adults and being partners, but we have almost none of it. I have a fantasy, sort of, that of what might be a real preparation for partnership. I would hope that in growing up, perhaps the fellow and the girl in their respective families could be part of a family group in which, and by a family group I mean something quite specific, where the family gets together to really discuss things that are of significance to each member of the family, and perhaps expresses their doubts and their gripes and their dissatisfactions with each other, and where they enter into a problem-solving point of view in relation to family problems. That would be a very beginning preparation, which could start as early as the child can understand anything. Then I think in the early years of school, if it could only become true that expression of feelings, no matter if they were good or bad, was recognized as a normal and natural thing. You don't just have to give answers to arithmetic problems. You can tell what you feel about arithmetic or about your home or whatnot. That's preparation for partnership, really, though we never think of it as such. And where at that same age, children could begin to accept honest feedback from other people. They could learn that they may think they come across as very friendly. Perhaps someone else sees them as very cold. That's important to learn, and there's no reason why they couldn't learn that in childhood. This has nothing to do with sex or marriage and the sexual aspect of it, but it does have to do with marriage as a partnership. And then as they grow older, I think that in high school and college age, there could be so much gained from mixed discussion groups of fellows and girls dealing with problems of dating and sex and marriage and the whole bit, where they would begin to realize some of the issues. I'll admit that it would take good leaders for that, and I think at the present time those are rather few in the public school area. Perhaps the churches might help to supply some of that. Then we could train them if we really had a will to do so. But people don't learn what to do with anger or with conflict. They have no notion of how to deal with it. Or, as I said before, with tenderness or loving feelings. And all of that could be a part of the training. Then I think a particularly crucial point is when fellows and girls begin going together. I don't care whether they're dating or engaged or beginning to live together. Before they've come to the final decision that they think they might get married, that's a time when groups of such couples could be intensely valuable. Because in a group with more feedback from other people, they could find out that some of their perceptions of each other are grossly mistaken. Some of their values aren't shared. I think so often the individual couple tends to keep their conversation on a fairly superficial basis. But in a group that is at all skillfully led, they find there are many other facets of themselves that they need to explore. And they could find out some of the mistakes they're making, as well as some of the strengths in their partnership. Then, of course, just to top it off, I think that in my fantasy, if after marriage and before many troubles develop, if there could be couples groups where they could find that the problems they have as a couple really aren't so different from problems that some other couple has, where they could begin to share their means of problem solving. How do you work it out in regard to finances between you and your wife? And what do you do about the fact of sexual incompatibility or seeming sexual incompatibility? And what do you do about the problems you're having with the children and so forth? They could begin to educate themselves, learning from each other. And I think that would, well, I think if that whole fantasy were true, we would have far more satisfactory partnerships. Many of them might break up before they ever became solidified as a marriage, which to my mind would be probably a very good thing. They might learn why this is not a good marriage to enter into.
Carl, thank you very much for sharing with us your insights into satisfying partnerships.
I am very fortunate, and the client is very fortunate, if I can feel I really accept you fully just as you are. Sometimes that's very difficult. I held an interview with a young man in South Africa. I didn't know anything about him. It turned out he was an officer in the South African Army. Now, for me, that meant it meant that I stretched my empathic abilities to their very limit to try to be with him, to try to understand him, to try to be caring toward him. I didn't feel I did too well. And yet, I've learned since that interview really changed the course of his life. So, I feel that if I can be genuinely understanding, try to listen not only to the words but to the meaning, trying to understand the person that's hidden within each one of us, that's helpful. If I really care about this person in an unconditional way, that's helpful. If I can really be myself in the relationship, not a professional expert, not a, quote, psychologist, not a psychotherapist, just me in that relationship, that's helpful. All those things are possible, and when they come together, that creates a very powerful climate for change, for growth, for drawing out the potential of the client.